aren't you? You're free. And what did freedom give us? So you have now all of these hundreds of years of slavery, hundreds of years of it. And then people will say, well, there's always been slavery, Joy. There's always been slavery. Matter of fact, you people enslaved. And there is, in fact, truth to that. People did have slaves, but not the kind of slavery that Americans had. Romans had slaves. I mean, almost every society had slaves, but not like America had slaves. Because American slavery, most people enslaved people of their own race, first of all. That's what happens. And that person was not considered less than human. Africans were considered less than human. They were considered de facto slaves because of the Aristotelian notion of a natural slave. The color of the skin raises a presumption of slavery, said Aristotle, which deems them fitted to slavery permanently. They will never, ever reach the bastions of normalcy as it relates to whiteness. They will never be fully human. 3/5. So what we have to understand is that the nature of American chattel slavery was unlike anything anywhere else, nor did anything else share in its duration. So we're talking about a real severe process. Now, how many of you are familiar with the Ma'afa? The Ma'afa is a Kiswahili word that means the great suffering. You have a wonderful celebration of the acknowledgement of those on whose shoulders we stand, right here in your fair state. The St. Paul Community Baptist Church does a Ma'afa commemoration, and many others are doing it around the country now. And so what was the state of things during the Ma'afa? And that's the middle passage of slavery. You know, Malik Youssef has a poem, he says, and he talks about how little kids try to describe the fact that we came over on a cruise. But on a cruise, you're not usually abused. So this was a real different kind of a cruise. So let's take a look at that. And there's a lot of argument around how many people died during the Middle Passage of slavery. The lowest figure documented with some level of accuracy is 9 million. That's the lowest one. And we don't tie a yellow ribbon on for them. We don't ever acknowledge them. When do you remember us acknowledging them? When? And they punished Spielberg when he tried to acknowledge it. So we need to understand that these were millions of men, women, and children that perished in the trip over. Millions. And we don't ever acknowledge them. Doesn't that seem odd to you? How could that be? We've not forgotten. We have not forgotten. But they have been erased mysteriously from the pages of history. They've been erased. And why do we erase people? To remove the what? The dissonance. Even during the filming of Amistad, the actors wept, not on cue because they couldn't help but weep. It got so they couldn't have white people chaining them. They had to bring in black people to do it because it was that unbearable. Spielberg knew. Why did he know? Because he didn't forget his Holocaust. He didn't. And you shouldn't. So what I began to realize is that this is morphed into a kind of lie that the annals of history, past or future, will never have seen. This is the biggest lie that has ever been told, as though it never occurred. How could we forget them? Millions. And what was the trip like? Well, you know that some of the cargo ships, they wanted to pack as many in as they could. They overbooked, if you will. And they did that for one reason. They did it because they needed to ensure that a certain number would go to market. It's like any other cargo you have. Some of it will spoil and perish. And so they had to figure that out. So they packed in oh, tons of people, rows of people, 18 inches apart, 18 inches surrounding them for sometimes months. 18 inches. Stay with me here. Stench-filled, rodents, feces. It's where they ate. It's where they slept. It's where they wept. It's where they urinated. It's where they defecated. It's where they vomited. And it's where they gave birth and where they died. In 18 inches of space. How could we forget that? But y'all are free. So when we begin to look at this, it's not a pretty picture, and I understand why people run from it. But my children need to know who paid for them. In my book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, America's Legacy of Enduring Injury and Healing, many people have said, Joy, where's the book? Where's the book? And one of the things that happened to me when I started to write the book is there was so much I needed to fold in those pages. So much. And the second process is, how do I market it? How do I sell it? How do I do all those things? And who's going to have the final call on what's going to go in it? That would be me. So I'm not getting ready to sell it to a publishing house and be raped with my injury. Can't happen. It just can't happen. So I'm self-publishing the book for those reasons. I want to read this because I think it speaks to the assault in a very, very good way. During slavery, so now we know what the trip over was like. Let's look at to understand that slavery is the antithesis of what it means to feel human. It is not a normal process for a human being to be in bondage for the rest of their lives. Period. When we discuss living enslaved, we are discussing only degrees of abuse. I have actually heard people attempt to justify slavery by arguing that many slaves didn't have it so bad. They claim some were even treated extremely well and were better off than people who were destitute and left to their own devices. Now, this has to do with poverty. You had something called Elizabethan poor laws. This is when Europeans, and if you really want to understand this, you have to understand what Europeans did to Europeans. And anyone that was poor was considered immoral, irreligious, and they were often imprisoned for being poor. And that's where you got something called able-bodied. If you were able-bodied, then you had no reason. If you had an able body. There was something called deserving poor, right? So there are obviously those who didn't deserve anything that were poor. I mean, the whole idea that these people were indentured to keep them spiritually okay. The notion was that this was spiritually important for these people. Poor people were irreligious people, is what was believed. And that's amazing when you consider religion and what we're supposed to do as religious people as it relates to the poor. All I can say is that these people are among the worst of hypocrites, for who among them would willingly give up their freedom under any conditions? Once again, let me be perfectly clear about this. Slavery by its very nature is abusive and abhorrent to the human spirit. It was no accident that the state of New Hampshire adopted as its motto, live free or die. Freedom means that much to all of us. It is detestable that constitutions were written and laws enacted to develop and maintain the institution of slavery. Slaves had not even the simplest of human rights. How many of you are familiar with the Casual Killing Act? Now, the Casual Killing Act was written so that if in the correcting of a slave, the slave was killed during that correction, it was not accounted a felony, but they were acquitted of all wrongdoing as if such act had never occurred. Casual Killing Act. Well, why would you have to beat a slave so badly? Well, you couldn't fine them because they had no money. And if you jailed them, their labor was lost to you. So you beat them severely, and so severely sometimes you kill them. And do understand that women beat their slaves to death, many of them, not just the men. So I began to look at that, and I started to try to understand how much, because see, you know how when you tell a lie, you try to keep it going? And you forget what you lied about, you know, because it becomes a mess. So when we start trying to cover up this horrible deed, it gets more complex. We have to write constitutions and laws. So you have to ask yourself this question. There's a book called Southern Slavery and the Law. And this book is that book right over, big, thick book. All of that was about the laws that were created to maintain the institution of slavery. That's how complicated. Just same thing happened with apartheid. Part of what toppled apartheid was trying to maintain the separateness. It got insane. It became financially impossible. Too many toilets. Too many bathrooms. It got crazy. White, colored, you know, it got crazy. And to maintain the institution of slavery, you had to maintain laws, and you had to also calm the mind, did you not? So let's calm the mind. So the first thing we have to do is make everybody feel okay about this thing called slavery, right? So remember I told you we have to up the ante and go to science? So now we have to understand they created laws so that if you killed black people, you hadn't done anything wrong. Don't feel bad about that. Didn't you say we're just correcting him? Okay. You know, you can go home absolved of any wrongdoing because you were simply correcting him. There it is in the law. Are you following me? Okay, so now the law has protected me if I should kill him. So now let's just start kind of understanding how we have to now indoctrinate the country. We've got to indoctrinate everyone into this belief system, even you and I, friends. It had to come from somewhere. When I started walking around and hearing little children use as a way of cursing someone the color of their skin, you black, you nappy-headed, start thinking about it. Or when you start looking at and I want you to stay with me here because this gets real deep. When you start looking at people and how they get disciplined, you go to the South and start looking at how children get disciplined. Boy, go fetch me a few switches. I'm going to braid them together. I'm going to soak them in water. I'm going to have you pull your pants down, and I'm going to beat you. Does that sound like something that might have came from somewhere else? Think about it. And after a while, we begin to normalize that behavior, but you got to understand where it came from. That's a whip. And I'm going to make you go get it. I want you to begin to understand that we got to be careful about what we call cultural. We got to be careful about that. So now when we begin to look at that, truly, and the reason it's not an indictment, it's an understanding of how we've never been able to heal. Because through this whole process, first of all, you can't even talk about it. We can't even talk about it as though it didn't happen. 246 official years. And if you want to topple that and look a little further, it didn't end when it ended. So when we look at these behaviors, when in there, I always ask, because I'm sure that maybe someone in the audience knows something I don't know. Do you remember the free therapy? Anybody? Surely somebody here remembers the lines or something. Where the sign up was, you put your X and you can come get the therapy because we treated you really badly. You don't remember that? None of it ever happened, did it? That makes us an incredible people, doesn't it? I mean, really, when you start doing the math on this, it's amazing. It's amazing what we've been able to do. So let's look at what they did to calm the mind on a more pervasive level. So when you begin to look at the statutes, every state had its statute around casual killing and how often you could, beat them and all whatever. But let's look at now, this is how it morphs into something else. This is when it becomes part of your consciousness, gets slidden, it slides on in there without you knowing it. Often I read this, but it's very important because it becomes the foundation of the scientific community's justification of slavery. Carl von Linnaeus, who lived 1707 to 1778, developed a taxonomic system based on a criterion of skin color and laid the basis for 19th century racial classification. Linnaeus properly began the science of anthropology. This gentleman is a father of anthropology. Although color classification of races dated back to the ancient Egyptians, anthropologists refer to Linnaeus' taxonomy in his Systema Naturae of 1735 as the first modern study of man. 1735. We're now trying to understand or categorize, classify human beings. And they'll say, although color classification dated back to the ancient Egyptians, I want you to pay attention to that. We go, why don't they want to ever attribute to Africa Egypt? Why don't they let us have Egypt? Because we do have it, Egypt. Why won't they let us have it? Because when we look at the knowledge base that was there, that emerged from there, the civilization that emerged from there, case in point, when I was going to go for my final exams in my psychology program, ultimately you have to take the Hippocratic Oath, okay? Now, when I first entered my physiology of the brain, neurophysiology class, I walked into the class. It was a big, thick book. If it fell on you, it'd kill you, right? It's a medical book because this was a medical aspect of what I was to learn. And I'm thinking, Lord, all the people, big, thick glasses were sitting in the front, the class. And I'm thinking, I'm going to have to take it twice, I'm sure. Certain of it, right? So I'm sitting in the class, and I'm looking at the book. Big, giant, thick book. And I open the front page. It's a glossy picture, and I'm looking at the front page, and I look around, I'm going, I can read what's on the front page, and no one else in the class could read what was on the first page of the book because it was written in hieroglyphics, and I can read basic hieroglyphics, and it said brain. And I'm like, whoa, it says brain in hieroglyphics on the front page of my neurophysiology book. I'm pretty excited. Now I'm thinking maybe I could take it once. So I opened the front page, and there is a glossy picture that was found in one of the tombs of the first ever recorded brain surgery. And they're showing you the drilling, the hole in, and the whole thing. And this is interesting because this is the front page. But when I graduate, I have to take what oath? The Hippocratic Oath. Because Hippocrates was what? The father of? I have a problem, don't you? Imhotep is the father of medicine. Not only that, it's no secret because you can't hide a pyramid, yes? He built the Giza step pyramids. So are we confused? I want you to understand how deep this stuff is. Then they'll go, well, now we got the first recorded brain surgery, which predates this man. Well, we're going to say that he's a father of modern medicine. Okay. Well, why are we still giving an oath to him? It becomes a thing where you have to question the psychology of it. And I'm saying they're showing me the truth and daring me to question it. Daring me to question it. I sat down, and I know I had, when I mentioned this because it astounds me, this particular one. When I ask everyone to tell me the continents, and I don't care what you say about this, tell me how many continents there are. People tell me there's 7. But before we can tell somebody there's 7 continents, we've got to tell you what a continent is. They give you the definition. A large landmass, partly or completely surrounded by water. So we talk about Africa. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. North America, South America, you name them all. You start looking at, Antarctica, Australia. It's all making sense. Then you get to Europe. Europe is neither large nor surrounded by water. It's a peninsula. But wait, people look at that and go, you get children, they take a test, let them not put Europe on there. You've given them the rule, you've told them what it is a bald-faced lie, and we still do it. Then you decide to name a continent Eurasia. Why would you name the whole continent based on a peninsula? Even if you want to tag it on, why would you call it Eurasia? We did it. We looked at it, we read it, we understood the process of what defines it, and we wrote it down. That is how deeply ingrained the pathology is to remove the dissonance. And we can't give you Egypt, because if we give you Egypt, then we're going to give you a level of intellectual capacity that we have deemed you unfit to have. Okay, so I want you to understand the psychology that goes into this. It's not something, people look at it, they want to deny our kings and queens. They want to deny that it could be you. Because if I'm going to subjugate and oppress someone that I consider beneath me, how can we look at civilization so great and justify that behavior? You see, it starts messing with the math. So I'll just simply take it out of Africa. And we bought that too. No one stopped in the British Museum and said, excuse me, there's been a major error here. You can't take Egypt out of Africa. You got to put it back in there where the African stuff is. Nobody questioned it because it fed on our need to remove all of the guilt associated and all of the doubt associated with what was going on. So let's see what else he said. While Linnaeus advanced classification with the use of a color criterion, he also fixed on his 4 families of man certain moral and intellectual peculiarities that continued into the 19th century anthropological vocabulary. He described Homo Americanus, as reddish, choleric, obstinate, contented, and regulated by customs. That would be Native Americans. That would be the people we erased earlier. Homo europaeus, and I think white people ought to be bothered by this one. Homo europaeus as white, fickle, sanguine, blue-eyed, gentle, and governed by laws. Homo asiaticus as sallow, grave, dignified, avaricious, and ruled by opinions. And Homo afer as black, phlegmatic, cunning, lazy, lustful, and governed by caprice. These insights into what Linnaeus defined as racial character, personality traits, behavior, intelligence, language, and a host of other related categories were transmitted into subsequent attempts at a science of classification and became more fixed than the races themselves. Not a shred of science here. Zippity-doo-dah, none. In a book. And the bottom line is you've heard these things attributed to us. Let's move in on that word lazy. We built the country. And what we didn't do, the Chinese did and the natives did. We are lazy. We fed your babies. You couldn't even do that. But the problem is not that it's a lie, but that we buy it. We will buy that about ourselves. When you go to right now the burial ground, what was so phenomenal about what I learned about that burial ground was how hard people worked. There were stress injuries. In other words, a man about 6'5" would have an injury that would cause the muscle to detach itself from the bone as a result of exertion. Who works so hard that the muscle detaches itself from the bone? No human being does that willingly, but you will if you have a gun trained on you. And then they turn around and call you lazy. And then we begin to buy that imagery. We begin to believe that imagery, friends, and for years and years of hearing it, we begin to believe it. Just like we began to believe Europe was a continent. So what I'm saying to you, that these things were calculated to ease the mind, to remove the dissonance. But what it creates, what does a secret create? It creates pathology. Secrets are those things that make us all sick. Secrets are what release the poison that creates the boil. And so what we have to understand about this is not so much what it did to others, but what did that do to us? What did we come to believe about who we are? I'll tell you, it's the reason why we all go, I heard that somebody got shot on New News. That wasn't nobody black, was it? Oh, tell me that wasn't, was he black? We start taking it on, right? Or we'll get in a room and we start having this discussion and someone white will get upset and someone black will stand up to protect them. Because we're so used to protecting white people from any discomfort. So when I began to look at the fear, I started to ask them, I said, what are you afraid of? And I had a white gentleman stand up in one of my classes and say, I'm afraid because I know that I have unearned privilege. And you ought to be mad about that. And so my assumption is that when you look at me, you see that. And that you might reflect that in maybe want to hurt me. And then, of course, everything I see on the news is that you are violent. For example, in the Rodney King riot, I remember looking at the statistics, you know, based on what I understood about what was going on, and then what the news covered. The news made it a black, real black thing. 51% of the folks out on the street rioting were Latino. 51%. But it was a black thing. So we have to understand that and then I went further when I said about this fear thing. So I said, so let me get this right. You are afraid because you know you have unearned privilege. Yes, as a white male, I'm clear about that. I'm not proud of it. I'm not comfortable with it. And I sense agitation around that. I said, okay. I said, so now what do you think happens? Because when white people are afraid, folks get lynched. Okay, stuff gets real ugly when white people get afraid. So I really want to understand his answer. Because my son's life may stand in the balance of that answer. And what I came to understand, that when white people say in the audience, the one way that black people adversely impact the lives of white people is because we are afraid, then we have to understand what their solution to that is. And the solution is, you need to understand that I'm afraid of you because of my unearned privilege that you might be angry about, because I know you've been oppressed as a result of that privilege, but you need to take care of me so I can feel comfortable with it. So we all know what's going on, but I insist that you make me feel comfortable about my unearned privilege. Because that's what we're supposed to do, you see. Because then you wouldn't be afraid. So what I want to explain to you is that's how deep the pathology is. Oh my God, I'm feeling upset and a little guilty. There's got to be something wrong. What have you done? You need to stop. I think he needs to be removed from the room because I've become upset, because it is so unnatural an emotion for me to have, a discomfort. You need to be removed because you're making me uncomfortable. In other words, your presence and existence is a discomfort to me. Now, either you remove yourself or I will have you removed. That's the story. So let's move forward so that we can understand that, again, you know, I didn't make it up, because it became now not only a part of the literature, it became the pictures. It became what we saw when we started to look at the minstrel shows. Remember the minstrel shows, what happened? All of the imagery that began to solidify those images of this shuffling, lazy, ignorant slave. To such a degree that we became embarrassed because we bought that the image was real. That's why we became ashamed of them. But we have to understand that nobody white looks at something someone else white does and takes all that on. They don't. He could be the president. And they'll tell you, well, you know, he's a fool. I have nothing to do with me. I'm so embarrassed as a white person, they don't feel that. They go, there just goes another fool if they happen to have that particular perspective of him. You see what I'm saying? So but we take it on. Hence, anybody black, doesn't matter who they are, stands up and says something, we all buy it and own it and believe like we got to defend it. You know, somebody will ask me about, you know, why did that black man have what do you have, a tiger in his apartment? I go, what makes you think I know why he had a tiger in his apartment? Now, what's deep is some of us will try to answer that. You know, that's outrageous. That's when we have to say, there's a fool. That's all that was, a fool. Don't have nothing to do with me. But we take it on because we have a collective injury, you see. And that's why when I talk about the transmission of post-traumatic slave syndrome, I tell you that it's transmitted. It's not enough to just deal with the family or the individual. You got to deal with the community because that's where it's reinforced, is it not? Here's where it is. So one of the things that I started to do, and understand that American chattel slavery ended, followed by peonage, unlawful selling of slaves into slavery, followed by black codes adopted by different states that says you can't come here even though you're free, north, south, east, west, don't matter, we don't want you. Sundown laws, right? Then we had convict lease laws where we arrested all of the beginning of, again, another fractioning, arresting all of these black men, principally, but not only black men, and imprisoning them with sentences that were, first of all, they were trumped up charges to begin with. And that's where overrepresentation started. Someone needs to do research on that alone to understand what was the impact of convict leasing on present-day overrepresentation of African Americans in the criminal justice system. There is a direct link. I can't do all that research, but do you see what I'm saying? We need to do it because the link, it's a natural line. They said it worked then, it'll work now. The only thing we got to do is get them to buy it. So they show you criminality over and over again to the extent that we're afraid of us. To the point where we begin to think that we're violent, horrible people. And so then when the bill gets passed, we sign our people away. We do it. And they say, they did it. They did it. Do you see what I'm saying? We need to take a look at that. There's research that needs to be done there. I did some research on that, but I can't.